Welcome to iRise Conversations with Joan. Welcome to iRise Conversations with Joan. My name is Joan Nwosu, and I'm the award-winning author of the book iRise: The 10 Secrets to Getting Up When Life Knocks You Down. A lot of people, that's you and I, in our lifetime will suffer from at least one form of addiction. Some are more obvious and widely spoken about, while others carry a huge stigma, so not openly discussed. And so many people suffer in silence and really don't know where to go to for help. Today, we want to talk about a sensitive addiction, and that is pornography addiction, its impact on the lives of the addicts and their loved ones, and how they can get on that journey to recovery. Our guest today is Joshua Shea. He's a pornography addiction coach, a certified betrayal trauma coach, and the author of 3 books about pornography addiction. He's a former porn addict turned expert on a mission to get the world talking about pornography addiction and the potential ramifications being a porn addict can cause. Since 2018, Joshua has given more interviews about pornography addiction and betrayal trauma than anybody in the world, using his wealth of research and personal story to promote the ideas that porn addiction spans all demographics, and those with a problem should seek help before it's too late. He also speaks extensively about the issue of working through betrayal trauma, especially with the partners of addicts and those who are facing infidelity. Prior to admitting his 24-year addiction to porn in 2014, he was a prominent magazine publisher, an award-winning journalist, a film festival founder, and a politician in Central Maine. Welcome, Joshua, to the show.
Thank you so much for having me today, Joan. I appreciate it.
Awesome. So, Joshua, I know it's not easy to talk about yourself and talk about this, but you've done it 1,000 times.
Right.
So can you just tell us a bit about your 24-year addiction? How did you get into it?
My case is pretty textbook. I am one of those guys who grew up before the internet. So we were talking about an age of magazines, an age of videotapes. And when I was 12 years old, my older cousin introduced me to magazines for the first time. And it was like I discovered something incredibly special. I knew that I had just found something that was going to help me through life. I knew I had just found something that was an answer for some question I didn't know that I was asking. And I don't know that I ever really figured out the question till, 20 years later, once I got into recovery, because ultimately what I was doing and what I was using the pornography for very early on was to deal with the trauma of abuse I suffered as a kid. I had a babysitter when I was young who was very sexually inappropriate, who was very abusive mentally, very abusive emotionally. And I found the pornography, and for whatever exact reasons, that's what clicked with me. And I'll tell you, nothing ever clicked with me in a moment the way that pornography clicked with me, except for 2 years later when I tried alcohol for the first time. And that was 14 years old.
Yeah.
And from the ages of 12 with porn and 14 with alcohol up until 37, about 8.5 years ago, when I became clean from both of them, those were the 2 things that were my crutches the entire way, whether I was married or single or dating, whether my kids were around yet or not, whether I was in school or early in my career or later on. It didn't matter. I always had these 2 secrets of the alcohol, and especially even more secretive, the pornography, that helped me get through any situation. They were my crutches and they were always there.
Wow. 12 years old, 14 years old, alcohol. Those are really, really young ages. And you said textbook. Is that the usual age that it's the early onset? Is that when people get addicted?
Back then, the average age was 14 years old. Today, the age that children start, the average child sees pornography for the first time at 11 years old now and is watching regularly by 12 years old. And that's because we give every one of them a smartphone and say, send them off into the world and say, good luck,
Nice.
without giving them any guidance whatsoever. But I say textbook because if you look at a study by Dr. Patrick Carnes, who's kind of the guru of this entire study area, he was the first one looking at it. He determined among American men, and this was one of his first big studies about 20 years ago, that just over 70% of men who are sex or porn addicts have some kind of physical abuse in their background. Just over 80% have some kind of sexual abuse in their background, and over 90% have some kind of emotional or mental abuse in their background. So the odds are, if you are a male in the US and you are a sex or a porn addict, you have some kind of trauma, because that abuse becomes trauma. That trauma never gets fully worked out. You find your substance, with the pornography, you wrap up that trauma in a little ball and you put it up on a shelf, and it comes back later to haunt you, and you've got to deal with it because your addictions just get worse and worse and worse. And if you don't go back to the source, if you don't go back to why did you become a porn addict in the first place? Now, I used at 12 years old and 13 years old very differently than I used when I was 23 or 33. But you've got to go back to that very beginning and work out what the heck happened and why did you become this way. And that's really the genesis of that story of why you became this way, and how the pornography, or in my case, pornography and alcohol, played into my life.
Okay. All right. So before we get into at what point you decided that you needed to seek help, you mentioned that the study was around men. Would you say the numbers are balanced between men and women when it comes to porn addiction, or is it swayed more towards men?
It sways more towards men, but I think that's because that's what we've been studying for so many years. If you look at the statistics of where is it growing the most, as far as porn addiction goes, it isn't with your straight white male. We've all been exposed to pornography since the 1940s and 50s. We were the audience that the pornographers went after because they knew they could count on us. They didn't know they could count on people of color. They didn't know that they could count on women. They didn't know that they could count on people who had different sexual preferences. Well, nowadays that you can create pornography for the internet and distribute it so much less expensively than you'd have to do, official real movies back in the day when they'd have to go into an adult theater.
Yeah.
You're seeing more and more movies geared towards these minority groups, because you can still make money off them these days where you couldn't make them back then. So we're seeing Black men, we're seeing white women, we're seeing people who are Catholics, people who are members of the LDS Church. These people have numbers absolutely exploding as far as addiction goes. And I think that they will catch up because, as it turns out, gay people have working sex organs. Black people have working sex organs. Women have working sex organs. We all have working sex organs. And now that they're making pornography in every flavor and variety you can find, I think that you're going to start to see a parity after a while. And if you look at statistics of just who's using, 91.5% of men who use the internet look at pornography at least once a month. Among women, it's 60.2% of women who use the internet look at least once a month. And if you pare that down to people under 40 years old, it's almost everybody, both men and women.
Okay. I'm shocked, not really shocked, but not really surprised. But again, is all porn bad? Because I know that as growing up as young teenagers with the hormones all over the place and puberty hitting, these desires start to emanate. So at what point is there any harmless porn, or is it all harmful?
I think it depends on how it's used and how it's viewed. Are there people who can look at porn without being an addict? Of course. There, just as there are people who can have one or two beers and don't become an alcoholic, or, myself, I can walk into a casino, I can play slot machines for 30 minutes and then I walk away. I don't have, you're not just an addict of everything. I don't have gambling addiction. But what I think is more important to recognize is, what is the message that pornography is giving the youngest people? One of the more interesting wake-up calls I ever had for this was, I was giving a presentation at a women's health group at a college not far from where I live. And I gave my whole presentation and I went into the Q&A afterwards. And this was about 3 years ago, right before the pandemic. A young woman asked, have you heard about women our age who don't want to have sex with virgin men? And I said, well, no, I have not heard of this. Can you tell me more? And a whole bunch of these young women all kind of just chimed up. Oh, yes, we don't want to, because those guys, all they think that sex is porn, because that's all they've ever watched. And when you think about it, it makes sense.
Yes.
If a guy starts watching porn at 12 or 13 years old, even if he's not an addict, the average guy will watch an hour and 15 minutes of porn a week. Well, figure that from like 12 to 18 years old. How many hundreds of hours of pornography is that? That is going to be their sexual education. And when you look at pornography, there was a study that was done recently where a group looked at the 100 most popular videos on 2 adult websites. 97% of the videos showed aggression towards the male, aggression from the male towards the female. And this was whether it's hand on the neck choking, whether it's saying horrible things to them, whether it is bending them like a pretzel. It was just, the criteria was, this behavior was not reciprocated from the woman towards the man. This same study also found that it interviewed something like 1,000 women and they asked them, have you ever been in a sexual situation and had a man get aggressive with you, a completely allowed, completely okay sexual situation, but a man gets too aggressive with you? And 40% of the women said yes. And most of them, from talking to this first group, and I've talked to many other groups of young females since, and it sounds like that these young guys are learning about sex through pornography. And their role models are these guys who are throwing women down on beds, who are calling them nasty names, who are, twisting them in different ways. And those of us who have had, quote unquote, normal sexual relationships understand that sex is not like pornography. Sex is nothing like pornography. But if you're a 17, 18-year-old guy, all you've been raised on is pornography, and finally you have a woman who's here and ready to let you, have sex with her, well, what are you going to do? Well, unfortunately, a lot of these guys start acting like the porn stars, and a lot of these young women don't want to deal with that. So you do see the rise in this like incel culture. And these guys who would love to have sex but just can't, because there aren't women who are out there willing to do this, because pornography is so pervasive. That has nothing to do with addiction. That just has to do with pornography's place in society. So when you ask, is there any good pornography? I guess good is subjective, but there is plenty of pornography, and its effects on our younger people are absolutely measurable at this point, because we've had high-speed internet for over 20 years now. So it's one of these things where we can see the damage that's being done even outside of addiction. And that's a big piece of why I'm out there. Yes, I was a pornography addict, but we need to almost, for lack of a better term, teach people how to use pornography, have them understand that, this is not reality. This is just, some twisted dude's fantasy who's making the movie. And this is not the way that normal people do this. There was another fascinating study where it talked about how the two things that young men think that are true are that most people are having anal sex and most people are having threesomes. when the reality is less than 20% of people are having anal sex and less than 25% of people are having threesomes. But if you watch pornography,
Mhm.
there again, oh my God, everybody's doing
Everyone's
this
doing it.
stuff.
Yes.
And it's a picture that's not accurate. So, what we're doing with pornography is we are raising a generation of men and women who are completely sexually illiterate to real life.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. Wow. A lot of dangers around this because, like you're saying, we're raising it's starting so early where
Yeah.
they don't even know better. And no, their parents are not talking. My parents are not talking to me about this stuff, and a lot of parents are not doing that. So
My
this
parents still aren't.
exactly, and I'm 43. But again, there's also all of this stigma around sex, let alone porn. Like there's just so much stigma, so much negativity around it. It's dirty, it's filthy, it's not to be spoken about. And so people are just
Yeah.
left to whatever's available on the internet. Today we learn everything from the internet. So people go watch porn and they think that that's the reality, and then it's so damaging. Like look at the statistics you're mentioning. That's so damaging to not just young teenagers, but even when they get into their 20s and their 30s and they get married, it's all downhill. Like I can't even see the any
Yeah.
positives from this. I know you're saying it depends on how you use it, but unless you're using it in a committed relationship, in a relationship with one person, I don't really see what the benefits are, but I can see now clearly. And like you said, if it's been measured, the harm and the damage that this is doing to not just the people, but
Yeah.
the society at large, the society where we're existing. So let's
Absolutely. And the challenge is also that so many of these parents and so many of these people who are now raising kids in this world see this as the birds and the bees speech. And it isn't. That's a totally different speech. You and I will talk about pornography here, but we're not going to get graphic. We're not going to get dirty. We're not going to talk about what happens because we don't need to. The don't look at pornography speech is like the don't smoke cigarettes speech or don't drink speech. It's exactly, in our household, we don't drink alcohol if we're children. When you're 18 or 21, you can decide what you want to do. In our household, kids don't smoke cigarettes because it's very damaging to children. When you turn 18, you can decide what you want to do with cigarettes. Same thing with pornography. Little kids should not be looking at this kind of material. When you're older, if you want to look at this stuff, that's up to you. But my job is to take care of you. So I don't want you watching this stuff. If you happen upon it from a friend's house or something, just let me know. And you can leave it at that. If your kid's 10, 11 years old, it doesn't have to be some kind of big, scary, scary speech. It's just another thing to watch out for. Let them know about it, and then you can move on with your day. And I think if we had more parents doing that and not being so afraid of, oh my God, now I have to tell them where babies come from, that I think we would see a big drop in the usage statistics and in the addiction statistics that are coming up because they are constantly going up.
going up. What was the impact of the pandemic of COVID on porn addiction? Because we were all stuck at home for like a year.
Yeah, oh, jeez, absolutely. And I wrote my third book I wrote was called Porn in the Pandemic, and I actually went and I studied as a journalist. I still had those muscles that I wanted to exercise, so I went through the data. I went through the usage on websites, and what the thing that I think will be the legacy of the pandemic that not a lot of people are talking about is the rise of the do-it-yourself at-home porn creation. We're talking about cam sites. We're talking about sites like OnlyFans.
Yes.
Um, January 1st, I can put it really simple to you. January 1st, 2020, this was right when the pandemic was starting. There was about 300,000 people making pornography on OnlyFans. On January 1st, 2020, or 2022, I should say, only 2 years later, there was over 2 million people
Oh my
making pornography on OnlyFans, one site. So we saw a rise of we added 1.7 million porn stars to the world just through OnlyFans in those 2 years. And I'll tell you what scares me just more than that, Joan, is that for my book, I interviewed back in 2020, I interviewed a lot of people who went and started to do the modeling online. And I'm not going to tell you if you have bills to pay, if you have to keep a roof over your kid's head, you have to keep food in your kid's mouth. I'm not going to shame you. I'm not going to tell you you can't do this. But what scared me was that I interviewed people 1 month and they were like, yes, I have to do this because my restaurant closed down and I'm a bartender, so I have to do something. And it's like, okay, I get it. I get it. That's fine. I went back and I interviewed these same people 4 months later, and several of them were still all about the money. That's all it was. It was that kind of thing. But there was a segment, especially the younger women, and this is what scared me more. The younger women who went over and started to pose on OnlyFans or some of these other sites, they started telling me things like, this is amazing. I love getting the money, but there are guys all over the world who want to take me out on dates. I can't get a date in the real world, and now there are guys all over the world who want to talk to me. Or I talked to men who did it as well, and they're like, there's nobody who loves me around here, but I've got 5 or 6 women who have offered to marry me because they love me so much, because they love what I do online. No talk of money, no talk of how much they're making, no talk of survival. They were talking, and it's like, oh my goodness, what I'm hearing is that these people are getting their dopamine hits.
Yes.
These people are getting their oxytocin hits. These people are addicted to making pornography. And isn't being addicted to making pornography just the other side of the coin of being addicted to looking at pornography? Whether you're a consumer or you're a producer, the addiction can be there. And I think in the long run, that's what we're going to remember the pandemic for when it comes to pornography, is not how many people it affected who were stuck at home to watch. I think the real legacy of the pandemic in pornography is that it created this do-it-yourself at home, industry of making pornography. And there are a lot of people who found just how addictive it truly is in doing that, and just how it hits their pleasure centers. And I could see those people 20 years from now, being 45, 50 years old, still making pornography online, probably not making a tenth of what they're making money-wise, but they're not doing it for the money. They're doing it for the attention. They're doing it for the love. They're doing it, to fill those empty holes inside. I think that's what we're going to say COVID was when it comes to pornography.
That is scary.
Yeah.
That is scary. That is scary. Yeah, I've heard of OnlyFans and some other websites like that. And like the numbers you just mentioned, that is scary. And I think if anyone's not scared, or you're thinking, oh, it doesn't impact me, you better be worried. Those numbers are alarming.
Well, and the thing is, we don't know what happens to these people in 20 years. We are long past the, oh my God, what happens if a photo of you turns up in 20 years? Who cares? Every third person's going to have naked photos out there in 20 years.
Yeah.
It's not going to be that big a deal. But what we don't know, what is the mental fallout of this? What happens, when you are no longer able to make the money you once did? What happens if it starts to affect your self-esteem, that you don't have the same customer base? What happens to people who do this for any length of time further down the road? We don't know, because this has never happened in the history of the world before. Excuse me. This has never happened in the history of the world before. So we're just going to have to kind of sit by and say, well, let's hope there isn't too much mental damage from this. Let's hope there isn't too much emotional damage from this, because we don't know what it is yet.
But we can start with the education. Like with what you're doing, you're really making people aware, because they might be thinking it's just harmless, I'm just doing it for the money, and not really realizing that they've become an addict. They might think, oh, I'm just a content creator, because now everything is under the umbrella of content creation. But they're not thinking about the mental health issues later in life, how it's going to impact not just them, but people around them. And I think with the work you're doing, that's a starting point. And I think, like we mentioned, parents should start having these conversations with their kids. People should need to be aware. of some of the ramifications of some of the decisions that are being made. Maybe yes, the pandemic led you to start, but you got to start thinking about this, about your future.
Well, and all of us, whether we want to admit it or not, we care how many likes we get on a photo on Instagram. Or, I'm not going to pretend that when I have a TikTok video that does poorly, it doesn't make me wonder, what happened there? And then I have a TikTok video that does really well,
Oh,
and it's like,
no.
oh, yay.
Uh,
I get that hit of dopamine off of
he tells it.
TikTok or
Yeah.
Instagram just like everybody else. But when you add your body to that, when you add your self-worth to that,
Yeah.
what happens? And I think that we can all understand that because we all care about our likes, we all care about our views. But now you're talking about bringing in human sexuality into that. You're talking about bringing pornography into that. What does this stew cause? We just don't know, but I think we can all understand it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about your journey to recovery. At what point did you realize that it was you needed to get help?
I realized very early on that I used pornography different than other people. I mean, I realized that in high school when a group of friends on my soccer team, one day after practice, somebody had a videotape and we went back to one of our friends' house and we watched it. And they were all making jokes and laughing and having a great time with it. And I was incredibly uncomfortable because that was not how I consumed pornography. And I recognized at that point that this was different for me than it was for other people. I kind of knew it was the same thing with alcohol as well, and it's really hard to separate the alcohol and the porn because they went hand in hand
Mm,
all the way straight up through. And I think ultimately I realized that the porn was as big of a problem as the alcohol because I always just for a long time I thought that my porn use was just poor decision making when I was drunk because most of the time I used porn I was drinking at the same time.
mm,
It wasn't until I was at rehab for alcohol, which I went to first, that my case manager started asking me questions about pornography, and he could sense that there was something up there. He wasn't well versed enough in that to deal with me, so he had me meet with a colleague of his who was a certified sex addiction therapist. And this was off in California where I went to rehab. So I met with this CSAT and he helped me understand that number one, addiction actually is a disease. I hadn't really wrapped my arms around that at that point, but addiction actually is a disease. Pornography addiction actually is the real thing. And then when it came to my life, not only was I a porn addict, but it predated the alcohol and it probably caused more problems in my life overall than anything else. So despite the fact that I was using, despite the fact that I it was almost a daily thing, I only saw my alcohol as a problem because everybody else saw the alcohol as a problem. My wife knew that I drank too much. My parents knew that I drank too much. My kids knew that I drank too much. The people who I employed knew that I drank too much, but
mm,
none of them knew that I was a porn addict. So that's easy to hide. It's not easy to hide you're a drunk. So
mm,
when I was at rehab for the alcoholism and it was introduced to me that maybe this is a problem too, that was the first time I really sat down and really looked at it as a problem. And once I returned home from the rehab, I have a therapist and who I've had for almost 10 years now. And I met with her and we talked about this. And after about 6 months of talking about sexuality and what porn was to me, I actually went to another rehab specifically for porn and sex addiction. And that was when it was absolutely crystal clear that I needed to do the very hard, deep work on the trauma and figure out why did I start using? Why did I continue to use? What was going on there? Because ultimately, in my view, and I think in most people's view who know about this stuff, addiction is not the main problem. Addiction is a symptom of a deeper problem, and that deeper problem is almost always unresolved trauma. And once I finally walked through that, once I finally started to go through that, once I started to create my narrative of how porn affected my life as I was growing up and as I became an adult, that made things so much more crystal clear to me. And that made me start to be able to work on myself as a person. I was it the porn, was it the alcohol that made me less than empathetic? Well, according to most research, they'd say yes. I've been working on empathy now for the last several years, trying to become a more empathetic person and more properly empathetic. And I think I'm doing well, but I had to get through the alcohol. I had to get through the porn before I could start working on this other stuff. To me, recovery from addiction is just a tiny part of recovery.
Mm.
It's more recovering who you always could be, who you always should have been. And to this day, I still occasionally have these moments of aha, when I realize something that I probably should have internalized at 14 years old, but just finally clicked. And thankfully, those still happen. Thankfully, I'm still improving. Thankfully, I'm still recovering. And I'm hoping that's true for the rest of my life.
Wow. I love that. I love what you said about, recovering from the addiction is the small part. The bigger part is really
Yeah.
recovering from who you were meant to be, who you always were, but it was all covered up with all this addiction because of the trauma and all of that. And I think another thing that you mentioned, I think is very key is, you talked about alcohol addiction. Like, it's easy to see. People can see when you're drunk. Substance abuse, like if you're doing coke or whatever, had drugs, people can see, people can tell. With
Yeah.
with porn, it's different, and it's very secretive, and people don't talk about it. And so, I know you mentioned one of the telltale signs is when is that you use porn differently as compared to other people. So for any listeners who maybe might be thinking, okay, I suspect maybe I do have a porn addiction, maybe I do use porn differently to other people, what would be their first step? How can they get on this journey to recovery, to really finding their true self and overcoming that trauma, the childhood trauma we're talking about?
Well, I believe that no matter what kind of addiction you have, you need to find somebody who has been through it and has been successful because they're going to understand you in a way that nobody else can. Now, when I do my coaching with people who are porn addicts, it's you see them the first time they're talking and they're very rigid and they're very tentative and they're very, scared to talk about this because they've been hiding this problem for so long. Within 15, 20 minutes, they start to realize that I don't care what they looked at. I don't care that, how many hundreds of times they've masturbated. I don't care what it is they do because I was there too. And I'm certainly, and I'm only better because people didn't judge me. So I'm not going to judge them. I'm not going to embarrass them. I'm not going to shame them. And when they feel safe for the first time talking about this, you actually can see their body language change during that first session into this relaxation. And I'll tell you, there are sometimes in first sessions, we barely scratch the surface. We barely talk about anything. And at the end of it, they're like, oh my God, I feel so much better. I can't wait to come back and talk to you more. I feel great now. I can't believe and I feel like saying, well, we didn't talk about anything. You just talked about this feeling safe for the first time. And that's the difference. Find somebody, whether it's a therapist or a coach or a sex addicts anonymous meeting or a sponsor or somebody, find somebody who you feel safe around, who you can talk about this with. And once you do that, then you can start to create a strategy for recovery and figure out just how bad is your addiction, how far along are you on the addictive trail, what needs to be done, what's the best steps to take. That's all stuff that can be figured out, but you need to find that first person who you feel safe talking to. And I think that's why a lot of people like me as a coach, is because not only do I have the technical side of things and I understand, what the addiction is and all this, I was there myself. And I would have loved to have somebody early on who wouldn't judge me or who I wouldn't feel shame talking to. It took me quite a long time to find that person. And I think the sooner you can find that person, the sooner you can get into proper recovery.
I love that. I love that. And for all my listeners, I will be sharing Joshua's details. So if you wanted to reach out to him, you can do so. Let's talk about the families, maybe the spouses and partners of addicts. Like we mentioned, there's a lot of stigma around this, and a partner hearing from their husband or their wife that I'm a porn addict might start to feel guilty or responsible, or might feel betrayed. How does that
Yes.
work in your experience? What have you seen?
Well,
How can you help those?
usually it's not the addict who comes and tells them. Usually it's the spouse or the boyfriend or girlfriend who finds out that this person's using pornography. And usually it's somebody who has created a boundary earlier on that said, I don't like porn. I don't think you should be looking at porn. Please
Mhm.
don't do this. And then they, whether they're snooping or whether it's unintentional and they just happen to find it on a computer or whatnot, they realize that their partner has been using pornography. And for a lot of people, especially women in this situation, there's the sense of, am I not enough? Is there something wrong with me where I am suddenly not pretty enough? Is there something wrong with me where I'm not good enough in the bedroom? What is wrong with me that's driving him to just images of another person? Here I am, a real life flesh and blood person, and he's choosing images of other people, usually people who are fake looking anyway, fake hair, fake eyelashes, fake boobs, fake whatever. It's an unrealistic image that the partner is looking at, and they start to wonder, why am I not enough? How am I not enough? When did I stop becoming not enough? When the reality is, if the partner is a true addict, it has absolutely nothing to do with you whatsoever. Absolutely nothing to do with you. And I illustrate this by saying, I became an addict of pornography at 12 years old. I met my wife at 26 years old. You tell me how I could possibly, how she could possibly have anything to do with my pornography addiction when I had already been an addict for 14 years before I met her. All I did was that I hid it very well. I learned how to hide it from my mom, and if I can hide it from my anti-porn Catholic mom so well, I could hide it from anybody. And that's just the thing, is that I was able to hide it for so long. Most men and most women who are addicts are able to hide it from their partner. And the thing about addiction is, yeah, you can tell me you don't like this stuff, but if it's addiction, my mind, my body tells me that I need it, tells me that I'm going to die if I don't get this stuff. I need this stuff to activate those chemicals in my head. If I don't activate those chemicals in my head, I don't even want to know what happens. So if suddenly you find out that your partner is super anti-porn or is against this stuff, you will go into super secretive mode. And that can last for years and years. I have clients who are the betrayal trauma clients. I have a woman who, for 22 years, she did not know that her husband was a porn addict. And when she found out, she went through all the things that the women who were only 2 or 3 years into a marriage do. Oh, what did I stop looking good enough? Am I not performing in bed enough? Are we not doing it enough? What's going on? Why is this my fault? How did I send him in the other direction that he suddenly decided porn was the way to go? And it's like, I'm sorry, but he's always used porn. He used porn before you ever got here. He used porn the entire time you're here. The one thing that I can tell partners to hopefully make them feel better, it has nothing to do with you, because ultimately it has nothing to do with what's on the screen. The only thing is, what's on the screen is what gets them off that day. And because we know how the brain works, that the brain cannot necessarily tell the difference between an image on a screen and an image in real life. And we also know that there's this phenomenon called the Coolidge effect, and it's been seen in many different animals, where repeated viewings of the same sexual image, slowly over time, the sexual arousal will slowly erode.
Yeah.
That's why so many people, when they use pornography, they never use the same pornography twice because you get the highest dopamine hit, you get the highest oxytocin and serotonin hit looking at something that's new. So what happens is that these guys who are addicts, they need to see on a screen the newest pornography they can get, because that's how they get the biggest high in their head from those chemicals. When they go and they look at their wife, who, unfortunately, after 10, 12, 15 years of marriage, well, you've seen every inch of her body hundreds of times. You've had sex hundreds of times. You know how that movie ends, but you don't know how the movie ends on your laptop.
Yeah.
And that's why so many guys and so many girls who are addicts tend to go for pornography, is because it's always new and they get the biggest high possible that way. But I can tell you, and I don't think there's a single addict who's ever disagreed with me on this. It doesn't really matter what's on the screen that day. If it's a white person, a black person, a Latin person, whatever, whether it's gay or straight, whatever, it doesn't really matter what's going on the screen, as long as you're able to get off to it, and as long as you're able to get those chemicals flowing, it doesn't matter. Most people don't care. And most addicts who I coach will tell me, I don't even want to use it. I don't even like this stuff anymore. It's almost like I need it, like it's a medicine. The way that, and this is true with alcoholics, the way that alcoholics have to drink just to stay even. Well, I think that there's a lot of porn addicts who feel like they need to get that burst of the dopamine every day, or else they just can't function as a normal person. So whatever's on the screen is on the screen. It doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with the partner whatsoever. But if you're the partner, it certainly doesn't feel that way.
Wow. Yeah. I can hear that. The partners, it's difficult because, again, like you're saying, it's not your fault, but it's hard, especially for women. It's hard for us not to feel like we contributed, or how come we didn't know? Does that mean there's something wrong with the marriage? And I can only wonder how. So, an addict, you go through the therapy, you get the help, you're on the road to recovery. What about the relationship? What about the marriage? Is there light at the end of that tunnel? Are couples able to really overcome all of this and go back to how they were, or at least to have a healthy relationship?
Some are, some aren't. And you don't want to go back to the way you were,
Well,
because things were not going well then. So you have to create a new normal. And he or her, whoever happens to be the addict, has to do the hard work to improve. And if they're not willing to do that, then your relationship does tend to erode over time. And I do see a lot of couples that break up. Usually I always say, try to give this person some time, try to give them the benefit of the doubt. They can get better if they want to. They can get better if it's important enough to them. Understand that this is not a moral failure. Just because somebody looks at pornography, that doesn't make them a pervert. That doesn't make them some kind of sicko. It makes them an ill person with an addiction, but they can take the steps to cure that addiction. They can take the steps to get over that addiction. The question is, do they want to? And to me, that's more the big question than anything else. And that's how I often, coach the partners on whether they should stay or not, is what is the mindset? What is the motivation? Now that this is all out in the open, when this gets out in the open, there's about a third of partners who are like, oh, thank God you found out. I can go get help now. I can take care of this. My secret is out. This is so good. I'm so happy. That's kind of a bit of the way that I was. And then, there's the third of the guys and the girls who are like, what? Me, an addict? No, not me, no way. No, I'm not. No, and these are the types who will gaslight you and even tell you it's your fault. And and then there's that third that is somewhere in the middle. And you just have to kind of figure out where you fall into it. How does your partner value the relationship? What are your new boundaries? Obviously, it's not porn, but maybe your boundaries are you have to go to a 12-step group. Maybe your boundaries are you have to go to a therapist or a coach. You can create new boundaries at any time, and then it's up to them to see if they want to live their life within them. When push came to shove, I'm so thankful that my wife stayed with me, but I don't think she would have had she not seen me doing the hard work. Had I not gone to the rehabs, had I not done the 12 steps, had I not done this other stuff that was necessary to change who I am as a human being, I don't think she would have stuck around. But thankfully, she gave me time and she gave me the benefit of the doubt to try and to show that I could make a difference. And that's what I ask people who are the victims of betrayal trauma is just see if they're willing to change, because if they are, you may be in, what made you fall in love with this person, you may rediscover that.
Mm.
And if they're not willing to try, if their addiction is too important to them, if they just decide they can't live without it, well, then unfortunately, you have a different set of questions you have to ask yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, education is so key for the partners as well to understand, like you were just really now, they're not a pervert, they're not a psycho. And I can see that's where all the stigma comes from, because someone admits I'm a porn addict and people's imaginations start going, well, oh my God, I have to keep my kids away from you. No, you don't.
No, no. I make a joke that, I went off to alcohol rehab and people, slap me on the back and say, all right, you're a hero for taking this on. All right, let me shake your hand.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, now I'm going to rehab for porn addiction. They're like, oh, where's the hand sanitizer? I'm not going to even come close to touching you. That's
Exactly.
gross. And that's the thing, is that so many people need to recognize is that if I can be a porn addict, a guy who's married, 2 kids, very successful, anybody can be a porn addict. It's not just the 19-year-old guy who lives in his mom's basement who's never kissed a girl in real life. It's not that 75-year-old guy who runs around the park flashing people. I'm sure they both are porn addicts, but in my travels, whether it's been getting recovery work myself or whether it's dealing with my clients, I've dealt with doctors and lawyers and nurses. I've dealt with people who every color, every religion, 18 years old, straight up through 70s. There is no stereotypical porn addict, and that's what people have to realize is if they think that they are part of some special group that can't be a porn addict, you are absolutely wrong. It's like any other addiction. You can absolutely be 18 years old and white, you can be 30 years old and black, you can be 60 years old and Latin, you can be 80 years old and Asian. This does not know any boundaries whatsoever. If you think you have the slightest problem, you probably do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Joshua. So, as final advice for people who maybe they're listening to all of this, they're suspecting that they could possibly be an addict, but they don't think they're ready to admit it to themselves or to their partner or to get the help. What final advice do you have for them?
Wake up, because if you're just going to keep doing what you're doing, it gets worse. One thing we know is that addiction gets worse. With alcohol, I reached the point where I couldn't drink beer anymore because it wouldn't do anything to me.
Wow.
You see people who are gambling addicts, they start $20 a hand, then they have to go to $50, and they have to go to $100.
Selling
It's
their
not
houses.
that
They're selling
yeah,
their
it's
homes.
not it's not that we're trying to get a bigger high. It's that we're still trying to get that first high that we got. And that's something that a lot of people don't recognize. And if you are asking yourself, do I have a problem? The odds are the answer is yes. And I say this as, how often do you ask yourself, do I have a problem with vacuuming? Do I have a problem with riding on fire trucks? No, the answer is no, you don't, because you know you don't have a problem. If you're asking yourself, if you're wondering, you probably do. Talk to somebody who knows more about this than you do. Talk to somebody who's been there. And you know what? Maybe you don't have a horrible problem, but isn't it better to know what the situation is than just to go on being the way you are? And if you do have a problem, letting it get worse before it gets better?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Joshua. Oh, just so many things. And I, like we started off with, this is a topic that not too many people are talking about. So I really want to say kudos to you for being on this mission to really, really educate people and allow people to get the help that they truly need. We're all created to be way more than we probably are. And sometimes it's not our fault, it's the trauma that we've been through. So there shouldn't be any shame around it. There shouldn't be any stigma. It's just a disease. You can get help. There is light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you so much for being here with us. And to everyone who's listening, again, like Joshua said, if you're asking yourself that question, the answer is probably a yes. So seek help, reach out to Joshua, reach out to people that might be able to help you, or just reach out to someone that you can start the conversation with and really get the help that you need before it becomes too late. Thank you so much for listening to the show this week. I will see you same time next week on iRise Conversations with Joan.